to a great week. So I want to call this meeting to order, and I want to welcome everyone to meeting number 20 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. Today's meeting is going to be held in a hybrid format, although our first panel is all here in person. In our second panel, we will have someone join us by video conference. So in terms of my initial remarks, I will remind everyone in the room, including my colleagues, please use the earpiece and select to the desired channel, depending on which language you would like to hear. I will, for those that are speaking, I will let you know, and that includes our questioners. I'll let everybody know when you have 1 minute left. As always, kindly wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. Of course, please do not speak over each other, as it will be very hard for our amazing translators to translate, and it makes their jobs very difficult. Please ensure all your comments are addressed to the chair. Members on all sides, kindly raise your hand if you wish to speak. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best as we can, and I want to thank you in advance for your cooperation. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on September 16, 2025, the committee is resuming its study on it's continuing its study of Canada's immigration system. I would now like to warmly welcome our witnesses for today's meeting. Thank you for coming in person. As an individual, we have Michael Barutsiski, Professor, University of Toronto, and I'm sorry, I should say your last name perfectly, given the fact I have 𝐦𝐵𝐿 in my last name. I also want to warmly welcome Stephen Paulasini, from the Regulated Canadian Immigration Consultant. And then from the Canadian Council of Refugees, we have Gauri Srivasan, who's the co-executive director. Thank you again for coming and joining us in person. You will each have 5 minutes for opening remarks, after which we'll proceed to rounds of questions. So we will begin with Mr. Barutsiski. Please, you can begin with 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The topic we are discussing this morning is polarizing, and it makes me a little uncomfortable to take part in these discussions. So I hope you don't see me as someone contributing to this polarization, but rather as someone who is seeking to find an acceptable balance. First of all, I would like to thank the committee for its work on Bill C-12. Regardless of what happens in the Senate, I believe that the proposed measures will not be sufficient to address the dilemmas of asylum. So I appreciate the fact that the committee is looking into this issue in its general review of the immigration system. We cannot say that Canada is in a completely different situation from our partners, especially those in Europe, but there are specific aspects to the Canadian situation that I would like to highlight in my remarks. I think, generally speaking, there's a lot of confusion about the historical concept of asylum. In my opinion, this is what was revealed by the Roxham Road saga. Rights were invented that do not really exist. The challenge of sharing responsibilities was not taken seriously, leaving Quebec almost alone in receiving a large influx of people. Furthermore, the diplomatic aspect was poorly managed, both interprovincially and transnationally with American partners. I would elaborate a little on these three issues. If we want to address the challenges realistically, we must recognize that asylum seekers are not automatically entitled to a hearing according to the 1951 Convention or Canadian law. The CIMM decision, for example, provides that applicants are entitled to a hearing, but only if they are to be returned to a dangerous country.
A realistic approach to our actual legal obligations is that the safe third country idea does follow the underlying logic of the 1951 Refugee Convention. It's useful to clarify the norms if we're still receiving relatively high numbers of asylum claims. Despite the government suggesting that there'll be a 33% drop in the numbers for 2025, we're still dealing with maybe around 115,000 claims. That's still competing with the highest numbers for EU member states. It'll probably be more than Germany, a country with twice the population size. even though Canada has a smaller population than Italy, France, and Spain. In 2024, we had more asylum claims than all those countries. They didn't have as much of a drop over the last year, so we'll see the new numbers soon. Si on reste avec des chiffres comme ça,
If we stick with such figures, we need to consider another internal problem concerning the sharing of responsibilities. The other misconception I would like to highlight concerns the suggestion that an asylum seeker cannot be transferred to another province without the consent of the person concerned. Section 6 of the Charter, which provides for freedom of movement, does not apply to temporary residents such as asylum seekers. Moreover, the German example shows how necessary it is to negotiate between federal states to distribute asylum seekers and maintain the support of host populations. Negotiation is important, not only within the Federation, but also externally with our allies. It is clear that our traditional partners are seeking to collaborate on asylum issues so that they can be addressed in an extraterritorial manner.
Supposed to provide anyone from anywhere the right to claim protection in any country, then I think we are deluding ourselves. The historical development of treaty law relating to asylum shows that there was never any consensus for such an expansive individual human right that gives migrants the ability to choose the destination country. Voters in our democracies have always pushed for migration control, so it's not surprising that advocates/academics have in turn pushed judges to interpret laws in the most open way possible. I believe we are now reaching the breaking point, and that's why our Western European partners have been tightening their rules and exploring extraterritorial mechanisms. So, to maintain the balance between compassion and firmness, I think we will have no choice but to harmonize our system with our allies and prepare the legislative groundwork so that this can happen smoothly. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair.
Professor 𝐦𝐵𝐿𝐴, and you were a perfect timing, so thanks so much for that. Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Paolasini. Please, 5 minutes.
Chair and committee members, Canada is deporting data scientists who are working in Canada who studied at our world-class institutions while importing unemployed insurance agents and line cooks from overseas. The economic class immigration system is no longer driven by economics, but by administrative convenience and political quotas. My name is Stephen J. Paolasini. I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant, an entrepreneur, and a very proud Canadian. I've consulted with thousands seeking to call Canada home, and I've watched this system deteriorate in real time. Take my co-author on this brief, 𝐦𝐨𝐵𝐿𝐴, a tech entrepreneur who built ImmiTracker, the largest international peer-to-peer immigration process tracking platform. The system that granted her PR years ago no longer exists. If she applied today, she wouldn't make the cut. Her spot would go to someone overseas with half her qualifications, none of her Canadian work experience, selected not for economic potential, but to hit a linguistic quota that 85% of stakeholders were not in favor of. Express Entry was designed, and I quote from the Act, to select those with the ability to become economically established. The problem is that the overwhelming majority of candidates already working and studying in Canada outside Quebec don't speak French. So to hit this quota, IRCC had no choice but to look overseas and sacrifice human capital and skills selection by extracting candidates with no work experience in Canada, no Canadian education, no job offers, people who've never even paid a dime in taxes here. Over 80% of those who became permanent residents in the Francophone category of Express Entry in 2024 did not reside in Canada. They were overseas. Last year, in 2025, nearly 50% of Express Entry invitations went to this category, a whopping 48,000 invitations to apply. This is our premier economic selection engine. What are the consequences? Data scientists, skilled tradespeople, entrepreneurs, doctors, researchers, IT managers, you name it, are going home. We strangely added insurance agents, a sales and service occupation, to the STEM category while removing 19 actual STEM occupations. We're placing pharmacy counter attendants in the same category as registered nurses and licensed medical lab technologists. We're ranking line cooks alongside Red Seal construction electricians. We expect applicants who are already here in Canada, who've been working and paying taxes, sometimes over half a decade, to somewhat impossibly reach over 500 CRS points. But those overseas get a pass at 379, a score even lower than when Express Entry was introduced more than a decade ago. This is not what merit-based selection looks like. We're also strangling legitimate innovation. Our only federal business program has an annual quota of just 500 PR spots, and somehow, within 4 years, accumulated a 42,000 application backlog. This is 84 years of inventory. My friend Mustafa of PavePal, he's the CTO of PavePal, is a victim of this program. He has 8 Canadians on payroll, projects in 3 countries, dozens of MOUs signed, and has raised nearly $1 million in private investor capital. He's exactly who this program was designed for. It's been over 3.5 years since he applied for PR, and at this rate, he'll be waiting his entire life. My recommendations to this committee: get serious about, number 1, restoring merit to Express Entry. Return to all program draws with a predictable cadence that selects for proven economic potential. Revamp the CRS to be more granular in nature and target managerial, professional, and technical occupations. Number 2, increase Francophone community immigration through the Francophone Community Immigration Pilot only. Stop distorting our premier high-skilled immigration pathway for a strict linguistic goal. Number 3, mandate full transparency in planning. If you're going to increase a one-time economic class measure by 7%, make sure that you also disclose to Canadians in the budget that you're going to increase protected persons measure by 380%. Canadians deserve honest numbers. 4, make stakeholder consultations mean something. Stop wasting taxpayer money on consultations only to ignore what Canadians have asked for and what we want and need. And number 5, commence damage control on the start of visa program. Triage the applicants like Mustafa who are building in Canada and work towards making a program that leading entrepreneurs can help design. Chair, the economic class must actually be economic. Let's build this country to have, once again, the best merit-based immigration system on earth. I'm here, I'm ready to help. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paolasini. Next, our last 5 minutes goes to Ms. Srinivasan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is 𝐦𝐿𝐴 Srinivasan. I'm co-executive director at the Canadian Council for Refugees. Merci beaucoup au comité pour l'opportunité, pour l'engagement.
Thank you for the commitment expressed by the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration for its concern in reviewing this immigration system.
For over 200 member agencies that work with, from, and for refugee communities and migrants across the country. From the work of our members, we have a profound appreciation, perspective, and a vision for Canada's immigration system. What is precious about it? What is at risk? And how it can and must be strengthened to ensure a fair, welcoming, and just system that supports a future where all families and people can thrive. You have said that this panel is to focus on the asylum system and that is indeed a critical aspect that deserves attention. Let me just zoom out first to comment on the wider context, and then I'll come back to the asylum system. Globally, we are seeing a rise in authoritarianism, in xenophobia and hate, whether that's in countries far away like Iran and India, or much closer in our neighbor to the south, where ICE's inhumane and violent enforcement practices include abducting people from schools, from homes, from workplaces, deporting people of all statuses to third countries where they are at risk of torture and other harms, and meeting peaceful protesters, as we have seen, with deadly violence. People in Canada have watched in horror, and in the face of global trends that are narrowing the scope for protection, we are asking, how will Canada respond? The federal government came to power at a moment when Canadians felt vulnerable in the face of political and economic threats from the Trump administration, and our collective instinct was to put our elbows up, to defend Canadian values, and to forge our own path. The question we must ask ourselves as we look to shape Canada's immigration system, and that you as a committee are contributing to, what is the Canadian path? I just want to remind us that we recently marked the 10th anniversary of Canada welcoming Syrians fleeing conflict, a moment that galvanized the entire country and reminded the world of who we are. We saw it again as Canada responded to the context of Ukraine. And we see it now as Canadians watch in horror and wonder how they can help and respond to what's happening in the U.S. We are still that country, but we must stand up again for those same principles. Instead, we are seeing steps in the opposite direction. We are not stepping up, we are stepping back. Just a few examples. The private sponsorship of refugee program is being slashed, despite it being one of the most respective and effective and cost-effective programs in the world. Government-assisted refugee numbers are being reduced, even as countries around the world are also doing that. Refugees in Africa continue to face significant longer wait times than others. The Group of Five sponsorship pathway is frozen. The government is looking to pass legislation in Bill C-12 that moves Canada away from human rights standards and norms of procedural fairness for refugee claimants, denying many their right to a hearing if their case is to be turned down, and to an appeal. We look forward to discussion of that bill in the Senate this week. But my point today is to invite us to consider that these decisions greatly misread the capacity and the interest of Canadians to welcome immigrants and refugees. More Canadians support than oppose immigration, and they believe in the positive role of immigrants in Canadian society, 66% versus 20%. CCR research has showed that when we polled, 1 in 5 Canadian wants practically to be contacted to get involved in welcoming immigrants and refugees into their communities. They are waiting. The limitations I put before you are not actually public will. They are government policy. But the policy choices are given cover from dangerous narratives that have taken hold and have been fanned over the past 2 years by all levels of government and across party lines.
1 minute.
The narratives wrongly blame current pressures on housing and social systems. They're not only false, it's dangerous, and it undermines confidence in the immigration and refugee system. It has started to seed doubts, but it has not changed core values. So this is a precious consensus whose unraveling has a great price, as we see in the U.S. and Europe. We're inviting you as members of Parliament to recommend the need for a whole-of-country effort to push back against these narratives. We've launched a national public campaign, We're Better Together, to reignite public support for immigration.
30
to
seconds.
Remind us, and we invite you to participate in that. On the asylum system, I want to remind you that Canada receives a tiny fraction of 2% of asylum seekers worldwide, and that we have a worldwide respected system. I want to say that the Safe Third Country Agreement is based on the premise that the U.S. is a safe country for refugees, and the evidence no longer supports that claim. There is no country. The convention is very clear that people need to cross borders to claim protection, and those are the rights that we have to protect. The ability for people to cross a border, to claim, ask for protection, and have their case heard on the merits. If the case does not have the evidence, they are turned down. The IRB is very good at discerning yes or no, and that is a system that we need to protect and support. I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Srivasim. So thanks to everyone for the remarks. Now, first round of questions, which is for 6 minutes. First up, we have Mr. 𝐦𝐸𝐸 for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us today and for your testimonies. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Paolosini. May Trin, who's an entrepreneur, was recently on BNN and noted that tech startups are leaving Canada in favor of doing business in the United States. In fact, she said Canada is like a really good-looking guy you want to date, but for some reason he makes it really difficult for you to be with him. Do you believe the immigration system today enables entrepreneurs to stay in Canada and build businesses?
I don't think it does at all. In my opening remarks, I mentioned a friend of mine, Mustafa. Like I mentioned, he has raised $1 million in private investor capital. He's doing operations in 3 different countries. He's got memorandums of understanding signed, and he's going to have to wait 84 years to get his PR. And yes, he's in Canada right now on an open work permit, but the challenge is the uncertainty for these applicants. We've got, like I said, 500 spots for startup visa applicants, and how it got so out of hand with 43,000 in backlog, according to the minister's transition binder, I just don't understand how that happened. I just don't understand, like they were asleep at the switch or something.
Thank you. You've also published letters to the minister regarding processing timelines and inconsistency. How would you characterize the current state of the IRCC?
A bit like a lottery, a little bit random. You never really know what you're going to get. certainly not fair, no transparency, and very limited accountability. That is my statement on the current state of IRCC.
You've also advocated for a sustainable immigration policy. Do you believe the current liberal immigration policy over the past few years has been sustainable?
No, particularly in reference to the. I will say that the reduction in the temporary resident numbers has actually been effective, cutting out the, let's say, the student fraud, the international student fraud, and the public-private partnerships with DLIs. But what was concerning was the one-time measure in the budget, where they didn't put the number for protected persons, but they put the number for students and economic class because, well, it's a much smaller number of 33,000 TR to PR. And when you look through the 2024 and 2025 stakeholder consultations and the consultations on express entry, it is obvious what Canadians want. They want to focus on skills. They want to focus on economic class, immigration, and I believe that's why they left it out of the budget.
So just for the record, in your view, has the current government's rapid increase in immigration targets outpaced the actual growth of our housing supply and healthcare infrastructure?
I believe the temporary residents did at some point. Like I mentioned, the current government did really reel that in, and they reeled in the LMIA fraud, which I was quite outspoken about over the last couple of years. And in terms of the permanent numbers, I think the numbers right now are relatively sustainable if they go with 380,000 permanent residents per year in the budget, not 455,000 when you include the special one-time measures.
So one of the phenomenons we've seen, certainly in urban areas across the country, definitely in my riding and the greater Toronto area, in New York region, is youth unemployment. You've spoken about the fraudulent labor market impact assessments, LMIAs. Can you expand on the impact this has on youth unemployment?
Of course. What happens is that employers, when they can bring somebody on a closed a closed work permit based on a low wage LMIA, they have basically a modern day wage slave who has to show up for work every single day, or else they're afraid that they're not going to get to realize their dream of remaining in Canada. And for employers that do pay the minimum wage, they find that these workers are better than Canadians who can just, they have an open work permit essentially, right? They can go work at the next shop and they're competitive in the market. So this has definitely contributed to it. And like I said, Service Canada has really cracked down on it. So.
Thank you. Thank you for your responses. Mr. 𝐦𝐵𝐿𝐴, you have described the current state of immigration as possibly the country's worst public policy failure in a century. Can you elaborate on how the Liberal government's failure specifically destabilized Canada's ability to provide housing and healthcare?
Well, I don't know if I can help on specifically housing and healthcare, but in general, there are large numbers. We were just talking about permanent residents. And we were going up towards 500,000. But that's only a small part of the picture. And the way that happened from right after the pandemic period, there's a huge explosion in various categories of temporary residents. We were never really even told about that. We couldn't plan for that. Okay. And when I'm saying 2-3 times more than the permanent residents. So it doesn't make sense to talk about immigration in Canada by focusing just on permanent residents. Just that little simple point, but it has huge implications because we're talking about many more immigrants, temporary residents.
Now, you've also argued that letting in so many people into the labor market and low-skilled jobs have actually lowered GDP. So, similar question: how does this touch upon youth unemployment?
20 seconds.
Right. Well, what happens if you're bringing a lot of temporary residents, students who then are working, so they're taking the kinds of jobs I would want to have if I'm 16, 17, 18. I'd want to work in a fast food restaurant as I did. I'd want to do these things. And if your competition is a lot of people from poorer countries, as a discussion paper from the Bank of Canada was telling us, poorer countries bring certain kinds, lots of younger people, they're studying, but they're not really studying.
Thank you, Professor 𝐵𝐿𝐴, and thank you, Mr. Menegakis. Next, for 6 minutes, we have Mr. 𝐦𝐵𝐿𝐴.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to all the witnesses for being here today. I'm going to start with Ms. 𝐦𝐨𝐵𝐴, I'd like to start with you, please. And you've talked a lot about refugees, and I know your expert work within the Canadian Council of Refugees is very important. You've spoken about fairness and dignity for asylum seekers repeatedly. I'm just curious if you have any suggestions around settlement services or procedural reforms, how we can ensure that they're proper and robust to help those who are migrating here to land well within Canada and be successful.
Thank you very much for the question. I'm engaged also a little bit by some of the recent exchanges, so I don't know if I'll have an opportunity to offer alternative perspectives. But your question is really important because in order to ensure that people who are provided protection through the asylum system in Canada are set up for success and not only receive safety, but then have what they need to contribute and thrive as full members of society, of our democracy and our economy. There is a lot more that we can do to reflect on building a system for asylum with dignity, as we say. There have been some critical, helpful first steps made by the Canadian government. We propose that there are at least 4 other key areas that require reform. One is that we need to establish reception centers to provide kind of orientation, triage, and referral services. And one has been set up in the Peel region, which is a very promising sign, but needs to be replicated. And there doesn't seem to be a clear follow-up plan. When claimants first arrive, they need information about where services are available and what the requirements are for them. Secondly, it's really important that the system think about a way to create cost-effective models for transitional housing for claimants. And we already have the know-how and the solutions in this country. There is, from the nonprofit sector, a network of at least 35 organizations across the country that offer already short-term and transitional housing for refugee claimants. These programs operate at a fraction of the cost of hotels and homeless shelters. They help claimants to find a lawyer, a job, and to move on to longer-term housing. And critically, establishing this kind of interim housing for claimants eases pressures on cities' emergency shelters. With predictable long-term funding, those models could be successfully saved up. So we could literally save money and save lives. Instead of the key is to invest in housing and build solutions that will make everyone most secure, instead of sort of spending billions to just block people from reaching safety at all and expanding powers for mass deportations. I will take a side moment to say that I think it's really important to reflect that the shortcomings and lack of action to, in fact, invest in housing in this country, social housing, affordable housing, and housing for all Canadians, which is an absolutely critical human right and need, can't be linked to the failures of recent short-term, or the question of recent immigration fluctuations. There is actually no correlation between the lack over decades of investment in housing and changes at immigration levels in moments in time. When immigration levels fell at the time of COVID, we did not see increases in available or in investments in housing. Housing responds to policy decisions from government and incentives in the market. And so it's really a kind of a scapegoating scenario to link them. A third critical issue is the one you've named in terms of making claimants eligible for support services that are already offered to all newcomers. The government, we have in Canada a highly developed network of organizations across the country that offer specialized services to new arrivals. But their hands are tied because they're not allowed to serve refugee claimants until they reach protected person status, which is 85% of claimants last year. And so we're just losing the 2 years when we could be supporting people with the very infrastructure that would help ensure a bright
I just want to ask you in the last minute and a half to also speak about how this helps with our economic capacity, GDP, and also the employment or full employability of those individuals who are given permission to work later on, 2 years later. You can just speak a bit about that too.
Yes, absolutely. I'll just say that the last element is legal aid coverage. Legal aid coverage is kind of critical for them to have access. When you think about the track record of refugee claimants, when they're provided with that support is to how to get a work permit, what are the options for where housing is. They find housing, they get a job, and they are well on their way to contribute to Canadian society. When we introduce in the system gaps that prevent their ability, for example, the renewal of work permits or the lack of a support service at the beginning that would have enabled them access to those to the information about where they find language training, where they find their application for the work permit, those are the things that prevent them from becoming fully participant in both in the economy and society. So when we enable people with the information to get on their way and live their full lives, they absolutely perform. And that's what we see in the economic data, both for immigrants and for refugee claimants.
Thank you, Ms. Srinivasan, and thank you, Mr. 𝐦𝐵�R𝐸. Prochaine, on a 6 minutes pour Monsieur Brunel.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for coming here. We have different opinions, and that is why we have a healthy democracy. Mr. 𝐦𝐵𝐸, from the onset, you said it was a very polarizing subject. I agree with you. I am the critic for immigration, and labels are easy to place on people, but we are talking about real people who come to this country and about the society that receives them. Let me come back to something that was recently said. A country's policy concerning refugees or protected persons, should it only take into account the protection of these people, or should it become the country's or the government's economic policy? If I understand you well, you're talking about refugees, asylum seekers. If we need to find the balance between respecting the rights of asylum seekers and the interest of the state, I think that when it comes to asylum, we need to look at human rights. The economic aspect, of course, is relevant, but we need to focus on the values and rights we grant them. We need to treat them with dignity. That is clear. The issue is the balance in order not to destabilize the state. It's not really an economic issue. I heard you talk about responsibility sharing. It's something that we're interested in. We are being told it's not possible. You demonstrated that it's possible. But in your opinion, what would be the clear legal limits that we don't need to cross for those transfers to respect the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? To the extent possible, it's good to receive consent from people. It's clear that Francophones will likely go to Quebec and Anglophones may go to the other provinces. But when it comes to obligation, we must recognize the fact that temporary residents do not have freedom of movement according to the Charter. So they could be directed to some provinces to share the burden and responsibilities. And that's the system that our partners in Europe, like Germany, have used to make sure that there's a balance. Otherwise, we find ourselves in a situation where, as we've seen in Quebec or in Ontario or in other places, we have an imbalance, and this creates tension. So I think that we need boundaries. So it's being done elsewhere in Europe, in countries like Germany. Are there other places where it's done besides Germany? Right now, I'm studying the German example, so that's the one I can cite, but I know it's happening elsewhere as well. Asylum seekers do not have the right to decide where they will reside. They don't even have the right to seek asylum in the country of their choice. And that's according to the 1951 Convention. They have to be protected. So in a context where Quebec is invoking the protection of its culture, its language, its social model, these are considerations that would be relevant to make sure that people are distributed in a fair geographic manner. It's clear that there are cultural, linguistic, and economic interests, and as well as political interests that come into play. That's clear. the different immigration ministers we've seen over the past 10 years, and there have been many. I've been here since 2021. I think I've seen about 5 different immigration ministers. Sometimes we believe that by changing the captain of a sinking ship, that will stop the ship from sinking. So we've seen so many ministers. Since 2015, every time the solution has been to inject more money into the system. But let's look at all the programs. We see that the deadlines are getting longer in all programs. Look at the temporary programs: students, asylum seekers, temporary foreign workers, permanent residents. It's the same. It's not all up. Do you think the solution is more money? And you talk about 2015. If you look at the Immigration Department and IRCC, the budget has doubled for the two, and the staff numbers have doubled, but we still have a lot of backlogs. 1 minute left. So I think it's clear that there was a lot of money and resources provided, but there are lots of cases that are not processed. So in my opinion, that's part of the problem. There are lots of people, but we are not able to process all the applications. So the figures were very high in all categories. There are other problems as well, but even with money and resources, we can't manage the situation. So how do you explain the current problem today if it's not a lack of financing, in your opinion? It depends on the categories. There are political choices that were made that may have not been the best choices. There are factors we cannot control. Asylum seekers maybe indirectly can be controlled. If you give lots of visas, then there will be many asylum seekers. So visa limitations are used elsewhere to reduce the number of potential asylum seekers. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but that's some of the things that are used in our international system. And that's an example of how it affects the categories. If you allow many people come in without visas, you end up with that.
𝐦𝐨𝐵. Next, we go to our second round, which is 5 minutes. And to begin our 5-minute round, we have Mr. Davies. Please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor 𝐦𝐵𝐞, in a recent article, you said that the extent that public support depends on sensible control of borders and intake levels, it is difficult to treat migrants in a dignified and humane manner if the local population is not fully on board with the country's overall immigration policy. To regain public confidence in Canada's immigration system, the first step is to encourage an honest and open public debate. This cannot happen if the government withholds basic information, obfuscates in its public dissemination, or simply does not have essential data. That's a very interesting statement, but I'm interested in specifically where do you think the legislation fell short in achieving or fixing the problems that you've identified?
The problem you're referring to, so in that report, I give recommendations, and I suggest that the House of Commons should actually be taking action and forcing the minister in the annual report to actually give more detailed data. And if we would know that there's certain categories that were starting to increase quite a bit, we could plan much better, and there would we'd be forced to have a discussion on it. What happened over the last few years, so this period 22, 23, 24, is that there are lots of changes to the system. It wasn't the permanent residents, so it wasn't tabled in the annual report. So I would suggest that in the annual report, so that's my recommendations in that report you're citing, is that we actually modernize the annual report so that there's a lot of data. I would like to see much more so that you can have more fuller discussions. We'd be forced to talk about temporary residents. If there's a huge increase, we would know that. We would have known that back in 23. I wouldn't have had to actually decipher through the various statistics. That's what I had to do started publishing in the Globe and Mail about this. Strange. All of a sudden we're talking a million something. The minister never mentioned this. So forcing the minister, and I think this is good for all parties, we would just have more of an open debate so we don't end up 2 years later, the media catches up, and then we sort of start having the real debate we should have 2 years earlier. It's unfortunate, I would say, that the minister at the time did not talk openly about this. The following minister was more upfront, But still, then we have to come and have good discussions and figure out. So I would say the debates are not the same as they were 2-3 years ago. So if we talk about sort of a change in public opinion, if we're worried about xenophobia, we have to actually recognize that something did happen in the last 3-4 years in Canada. And I don't say the last year. Of course, our neighbors to the south have destabilized lots of things around the world. But on this question,
I have pretty limited time, so I'd like to get a couple of questions. But to follow up on that, the Conservatives have proposed some key amendments to Bill C-3 that were later withdrawn when it went to the report stage of the House, specifically related to transparency, the sort of the stuff you're talking about here. That was removed. In the fall budget, the Liberals named 35,000 one-time slots that they can allocate for any purpose, including given permanent residency status to people who have crossed illegally into Canada. Isn't this a counterproductive measure?
sorry, I'm not sure I completely understood, but if you're saying that sort of we don't want transparency on situations involving people.
Well, it's an allocation of 35,000 people that we have no real idea of who they are, where they come from, but they can have access to permanent residency without much transparency. Would you think that's a good idea?
I would say, of course not.
Okay. You had mentioned early in your that rights were created that really didn't exist before. Can you explain that, please?
1 minute.
So if we look very carefully what the Prime Minister was saying and the government was saying in 2017, was saying that anybody showing up at the border has a right to a hearing. We were referring to the Roxham Road situation, but we go then to 2024. The Prime Minister is saying in a YouTube video, in the French version only, not the English version, that, oh, that was actually abused. So, and we actually then changed the rules because we don't have an automatic right to claim asylum at the border. There is actually there's inadmissibility questions. The Refugee Convention doesn't give you that right. If you're protected in another state, you're supposed to protect refugees. But where they're actually protected, that's that's a whole bunch of other factors coming in.
So when you said we need to align ourselves with our partners in the world, I mean, is that one of the key sectors that you would suggest needs alignment?
Yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. The solutions that our partners, and I'm spending a lot of time with our European partners, and the governments are looking at different ways to deal with this, hopefully in a humane way that balances. We want to protect. So I agree with what my colleague was saying. We do want to be careful about xenophobic tendencies, but we want to be realistic about it. And I'm saying we went too far on the sort of the rights. And so our partners are actually quite active on this, and I'm afraid that if we don't start working here much more actively, that we'll be behind. They'll be innovating different kinds of protection systems, and we'll be behind.
Thank you, Professor 𝐦𝐨𝐫𝐞, and thank you, Mr. Davies. I would say to you, if you have specific, this is again a study on our immigration system, if you have specific data that you feel should come in the annual report, please make sure to submit that to our committee so that we can consider that at report time. Thank you. Our next 5 minutes goes to Ms. Salma Zaid.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to all the witnesses for appearing before the committee. My first question is for Madam Srinivasan. Thanks a lot for appearing today. You were quoted in ENCA in December saying Canadian politicians are exploiting a global current surrounding immigration, where newcomers are blamed for a range of challenges, including the housing shortages and overstretched healthcare systems. You said Canada's population is declining and immigration is essential to our future prosperity, and warned against the use of toxic and xenophobic narratives that can harden attitudes against newcomers. So could you please expand on that point? What can those who recognize the importance of a managed immigration system do to counter those narratives?
Thank you very much for the question. It is essential that we have data-informed and evidence-based information that we share with the Canadian public, and we're even hearing it now. So when I speak about the importance of the narrative, the narrative is a story that has to be based on what both respond in a way that Canadians can understand, but based on the evidence of what is happening. And so there is such a positive and evidence-based story that governments at all levels can tell about the role of immigration in Canada and the functioning system and the skills and capacity that we have in order to maintain Canadians' confidence in the immigration system and the system of asylum. So I think it's really important on the asylum question to recognize that Canada's Immigration and Refugee Board and Canada's overall asylum system is actually looked to around the world as a world-class system that has developed an evidence-based way to have a quasi-judicial hearing so that all claims are heard on the evidence. The IRB looks carefully at the evidence and it determines which claims are substantiated and which claims are not. So when we say that people have a fundamental right to claim asylum, that is in fact fundamental. With respect, the suggestion that rights have been invented, that kind of language creates a kind of an uncertainty and a fear that doesn't help. The rights are very clear and codified in the UN Charter. Both in the UN Convention and in the Canadian Charter. You have the right, if you cross a border, to ask for protection. You don't have a right to get a yes. But that is not the system we have. We have a system that establishes the merits of a claim. What was very clear from the CIMM decision was that everyone in Canada, including temporary residents, if you're in Canada, you have a right to be able to speak to the merits of your claim before being deported to potential danger, because officials make mistakes, and these are matters of life and death. So the CIMM decision said you cannot render a no decision without a hearing, and that is the only right that the community and that human rights lawyers are defending. It is in fact what the Supreme Court has backed, and it is in fact what the UNHCR testified before this committee is missing in Bill C-12. So the obligation for us to think about the opportunity to describe for Canadians where are the places that the system can be improved? For example, when we speak about the money, what is the money being thrown around? Could it be spent better? 100%
1
yes.
minute.
Right? So our member organizations are saying that there is an incredibly positive story we can tell that builds on Canadians' values to welcome refugees in terms of how we create the effective infrastructure to welcome them. There are cost-effective solutions to interim housing that takes pressure off city shelters, that enables refugee claimants to get access to the supports they need to get a job and get on their way with their lives. And we can do that by welcoming more people in dignity and enable them to contribute to Canada than very expensive emergency systems that don't think about what it is that refugees may need when they come to seek asylum, and ends up with these kind of last-minute measures, busing people to different parts of the country or having hotels. So we can have a much more cost-effective and a much more dignified system, and then we can tell the story. My point was to say we can tell Canadians we can maintain an open country, one that gives people due process at the border and that supports people to have dignified lives, to be able to contribute, and one that strengthens all of Canadians.
Thank you,
because we need
Ms.
to respond to their
Srinivasan,
rights
and
as
thank
well.
you, Ms. Zaid. Maintenant, on a 2 minutes et demie pour Monsieur.
Mr. Brunei-Duceppe, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'm looking at the analyst. I am hearing two totally different opinions on something that should be based on fact. It's either true or false. Mr. Barutitsky, are we entitled to a hearing or not? Because we're hearing two completely different things on things that should be easy to understand. The narrative talked about 5 sick people who had to be sent to India. They had to be sent to India in the 80s during tension, and they had to be sent without a hearing. Under those circumstances, in the Canadian legislation, we have ineligibility clauses. If someone shows up at the border, the person cannot seek asylum. But at the time, the word asylum was not even mentioned. There was no process. And that's the debate we're talking about. For many years, the legal community and advocates thought that we had attained very progressive rights. Now we are realizing that we have exaggerated and there are many problems. And we find ourselves in situations where we have to admit that there has been exaggeration, and that debate has been ongoing for years. So it's sad that some segments of our community want to help refugees, and they're saying there are many states that felt that people were entitled to a hearing, but that's not the case. Our friends in Europe and elsewhere are also studying the problems. 30 seconds left. And you're saying that newcomers could have an impact on health services, housing, and so on. And there's the dangerous narrative targeting newcomers. Is there a healthy discussion we could have on government policy saying that these people should not be targeted? I hope we are not criticizing immigrants, the persons. We are criticizing government policies. It's government policies that should be targeted, and they should be criticized if that is the case.
We have 7 minutes left in this round, so I'm going to give 3.5 minutes to Ms. Remble-Gardner and 3.5 minutes to Mr. 𝐦𝐽𝐵𝐿. Please.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Srinivasan, I just wanted to go back to something you said earlier. You claim that there was no correlation between rapid immigration growth of the last several years and the decrease of Canada's available housing supply. Is that correct?
Yes, more or less. I think they were.
So you think that, like, even though we had millions of people come in, that had no impact on housing supply or prices in Canada?
I'm saying that the factors that drive the cost of housing and the availability of housing are much more related to the questions of the financialization of housing as an asset, rent control, so policies that are...
You don't think bringing in millions of people in a very short period of time like that had no impact on housing, even though, like, major economists and most Canadians' lived experience says otherwise? I'm just asking from a perspective so that we can qualify your comments in a further report, because that seems a little bananas to me.
So I appreciate that there's a sort of a natural logic of input supply must have an immediate effect on demand.
Thank
and
you.
I am sure in specific markets
with the
that
time
there
I
are...
have left, Mr. Bartschitsky, we have about 3 million people by the end of this year that are on expired or expiring visas. The government has continued to set temporary resident targets, making the assumption that these people would leave. If these people do not leave, as the law requires them to do, should the government continue to accept hundreds of thousands of temporary residents, as they have currently outlined in their levels plan?
No, the government shouldn't, and that's why we should be cutting, because we don't know what will happen with those 3 million.
Would it be fair to say that those numbers need to drop to near negligible if they don't have a plan to have 3 million people leave as they should?
I don't know what you mean by negligible or near negligible, but dropped considerably. So what I recommend
if 3 million people don't leave, how many people should the government be bringing in on temporary resident visas?
a very small number.
A very small number. I would agree. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you so much. Next, we go to Mr. 𝐦𝐵𝐿.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to continue with Ms. Srinivasan. And I want to, you, in your initial remarks, spoke about We Are Better Together, this campaign. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that in the brief time that we have?
Thank you very much. My mic is on. What we feel is very important is to recognize the strong values and commitment that exist in Canada, that people are ready and keen to welcome immigrants and refugees. But the polling has shown that they've begun to have doubts, that they do have questions about what's happening, and they need a sense of confidence restored, but they're also looking for a government and a policies that uphold the traditions that they identify with. So our comment is that we're looking for a way to enable Canadians who are prepared and are willing and ready to welcome refugees and immigrants and who want the government to continue those traditions to signal that. That is the obligation that we all have, because the more that leaders cast doubts and start to have Canadians question that system, they also move with that narrative. So the opportunity of the We're Better Together campaign is to invite both organizations in civil society and members of Parliament to stand up to the values and the ideals that we know, whether our families came here last year or 100 years ago, across languages and cultures in this country, we look out for each other. And that we are a stronger country when we are together. We are a stronger and more country when we are more diverse. And that is the message that we want to tell people, because increasingly, many people in Canada are starting to feel not safe, and they're questioning their whole, the question of choosing Canada or not. And we are deciding the future of the kind of country we want to build. When we see what's happening in the U.S., I think there are many, many people in Canada, and our experience in communities across the country is that people want to stand up and say that we have a different way, where we want to have a system that provides a safe future for all families, refugees, migrants, and immigrants. And to do that, we have to start sharing those stories and speaking to that. So we're inviting members of Parliament to join the campaign, for organizations to join the campaign, so that we can find solutions together, but that tell that story loud and proud, so that we maintain the commitment that we will, in the long term, stay an inclusive and strong country.
Monsieur 𝐦𝐨𝐫𝐞, j'ai vu votre comportement physique quand. Est-ce que vous êtes d'accord qu'on doit avoir?
Do you agree that we need a positive narrative on immigrants and refugees, and the government has its role to play to make sure that is done? I totally agree with what my colleague has just said. And I'll simply add that that is the context in which we want to preserve the system. If there are problems with the system, we need to recognize that and manage the problems. So that's why I told the other MP that historically numbers should have been reduced significantly. In the 80s, the two parties in government had reduced the numbers when there was tension. So we need to go back to that and not automatically assume that there will be many. There were historic figures. We need to reduce the numbers to preserve this cohesion and this Canadian value. I think that's very positive. Things that were done 10 years ago cannot apply today.
Thank all the witnesses for their time and for your important contributions to this study. If there's anything that you're thinking that you want to add on to your responses, or any additional information you want to provide to the committee, please submit it formally, and then it will be considered when we are looking at the testimony for our final report. So I think with that, we're going to suspend for 5 minutes so the witnesses can leave, and we'll get back with the second panel. Thank you. Welcome back. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of our new witnesses. So we do have a couple of our guests, our witnesses, joining with us on Zoom. So just a reminder to them, I'm sure that you've run through this already in your test, but just as a reminder, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. At the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either floor, English, or French. And of course, for those in the room, if you could just make sure that you use your earpiece and select the desired channel. Okay? And to all, just a reminder, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed through the chair. And now I would like to formally welcome our witnesses for the second panel. As an individual, we have Mr. 𝐦𝐽𝐿 𝐷𝐸𝐺, immigration lawyer, who's joined us by video conference. Here in person from C.D. Howe Institute, we have Dr. Parisa Mahboubi, Associate Director of Research. And then from the Halifax Partnership via teleconference, we have Wendy Luther, President and Chief Executive Officer. So each of you will have up to 5 minutes for opening remarks, after which we will proceed to rounds of questions. And we'll start with Mr. 𝐷𝐸𝐺. Please, you can begin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to appear today for the members of the committee, and I'm appearing in my personal and professional capacity to contribute to your study of Canada's immigration system. My remarks today will focus on express entry, more specifically on category-based selection for Francophone candidates. I want to be clear at the outset. Francophone category-based draws have been a good starting point. They have increased Francophone admissions outside Quebec and have produced tangible and measurable results. They've also sent a clear policy signal about the importance of Francophone vitality. Cela dit, le comité a aussi entendu
At the same time, the committee has also heard serious and credible criticisms. Some relate to perceived fairness. Others relate to labor market alignment. Others relate to transparency and predictability within the express entry. These criticisms should not be ignored. I would also like to echo a point raised by many lawyers before this committee. After more than 5 years of pandemic-related disruption, the system needs stability, predictability, and fortified service standards. Frequent policy shifts without clear service benchmarks undermine confidence amongst applicants, employers, and provinces alike. We are therefore not looking at a policy failure. We are looking at a policy that works, but that now reveals its limits. The question is not whether to abandon Francophone draws. The question is how to evolve, use them intelligently within a more stable and better governed system. I'm therefore proposing a possible next step. Rather than maintaining French as a standalone category, it could be more deeply integrated into other priority categories. French would become an enhanced factor when combined with strong human capital. Today, for example, the cap for bilingualism is 50 points. One option would be to increase that cap, for example, to 100 points when French proficiency is combined with a high-demand occupation, for example, in healthcare. This approach builds on what already works. It preserves the Francophone objective. It responds to labor market needs. It reduces perceptions of displacement or unfairness. It also contributes to system stability by reducing reliance on ad hoc policy adjustments.
Dismantling express entry, it can be implemented through a recalibration of point weights. However, it should be accompanied by clear service standards and a commitment to policy stability. In closing, Francophone draws have been a good starting point. Now that the committee has heard the critiques, and there's plenty of that, there's an opportunity to take the next step. By strengthening both the system design and service standards, Canada can restore confidence and legitimacy in its immigration system when it comes to Francophone immigration. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Next, for 5 minutes, we'll go to In the Room, Dr. 𝐦𝐨𝐫𝐞.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this important work on immigration levels. Immigration remains essential to Canada's economic and demographic future, but its benefit depends critically on whether immigration levels align with housing supply, infrastructure, public services, and labor market capacity. Canada faces demographic pressures, an aging population, declining birth rates, and rising old age dependency ratio. However, 𝐦𝐨𝐫𝐞 Institute research consistently shows that immigration alone cannot fully address these challenges. Under any reasonable immigration rate, Canada will become both larger and older. Immigration can slow aging, but it cannot prevent it. Treating immigration as a demographic cure risks pushing levels beyond what the economy and housing system can absorb. Following the pandemic, Canada experienced an unprecedented surge in population growth, driven largely by temporary residents. Year-over-year growth peaked in 2023 at just over 3%, remained elevated in 2024, and then it slowed sharply in 2025 as policy changes took effect. A key message from the 𝐦𝐨𝐫𝐞 Institute work on immigration is that immigration level targets should account for both permanent and temporary immigration to ensure overall levels align with Canada's economic and social capacities. Focusing only on permanent admissions understates the true population impact and leads to systematic underplanning.
Point d'ordre, Madame la Présidente. On n'a pas d'interprétation depuis à peu près 30 secondes.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Okay. Monsieur Brunet-Duceppe, please continue.
The consequences of this misalignment are evident. Housing supply has struggled to keep pace with population growth. As a result, the rental vacancy rate fell to 1.5% in 2023, its lowest level since 1988, and rents increased significantly. 𝐦𝐨𝐫𝐞 Institute research also highlights the economic risk of rapid population growth without matching investment. Immigration increases total GDP, but when capital investment lags behind population growth, productivity and GDP per capita suffers. This pattern aligns closely with Canada's recent economic experience. The temporary residence population has been central to these challenges. Many have concentrated in low-skilled jobs despite high education levels, intensifying competition for entry-level positions and likely contributing to rising youth unemployment. Compounding these are significant shortcomings in how Canada tracks and monitors its temporary residence workforce. Canada's temporary residence population expanded rapidly through 2024, peaking at over 3 million before beginning to decline in response to recent policy changes. Even with that decline, the imbalance between temporary residents and permanent admissions remains substantial. The ratio of temporary residents to permanent admissions increased from roughly 3:1 in 2022 to about 7:1 in 2025, placing sustained pressure on the immigration system, including the asylum system. as many seek pathways to permanent residency. Stabilizing population growth in the short term is critical, and managing the non-permanent resident population is necessary to restore balance. Immigration policy must align with absorptive capacity, setting levels that reflect housing supply, infrastructure, investment, healthcare capacity. This requires a long-term vision that coordinates immigration planning with infrastructure development, workforce participation, and capital investment. Composition matters as much as levels. Benefits depend on